Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving into a really crucial and frankly immediate legal challenge. How do we regulate highly autonomous artificial intelligence systems? Specifically, those taking on fiduciary roles in corporate governance, the autonomous board member.
It's unavoidable, isn't it? Our current laws, they were designed for human reasoning and human errors. They just don't have the precision needed for algorithms making these high-stakes, real-time decisions.
Exactly. So the question before us today is really about the foundational step. What comes first? Should we prioritize creating a dedicated, machine-readable operational environment inside corporations, what we're calling a dual-version local regulatory context? Or must the first step be a much more sweeping universal overhaul to establish a true system of computational law? I'm going to argue that establishing this precise operational context, defined through these dual-version corporate documents, is the essential, practical foundation. It's the technical prerequisite upon which safe, effective, and importantly, auditable AI governance legislation has to be built.
And I'll be coming at it from a slightly different angle. The need for precision, that's undeniable. But focusing our foundational efforts on localized internal documents, well, that risks creating a huge amount of regulatory fragmentation. It addresses the operational symptoms, but it completely avoids the systemic disease. We have to acknowledge the fundamental difference between human legal reasoning, which is rooted in, shared social constructs, and algorithmic decisions, which are purely technical. So for me, the foundation must be a universally applicable system of computational law that addresses this philosophical gap head-on. If we just let companies rewrite their internal policies, we're building a national regulatory house on quicksand.
I see why you'd emphasize that sweeping transformation, but let me offer a perspective rooted in what I see as engineering necessity. To guarantee operational quality and safety, any autonomous system, and this is drawn directly from standards like SAE J3016 for autonomous vehicles, it requires a clearly defined operational context, an operational design domain, or ODD.
ODD.
Yes, the OOD. And for corporate AI, a huge part of that OOD is the complex regulatory and legal environment the company operates in. This environment has to be machine readable. So the most practical, immediate, and I think actionable way to get this precision is by defining local regulatory documents, policies, corporate codes, bylaws, simultaneously in two versions, one for humans and one that is explicitly and precisely formulated for the AI. This isn't just a theory. We see parallels in global commerce where some jurisdictions require, say, bilingual contracts to ensure precise operational clarity. This locally created OOD framework, it provides the technical clarity that then enables broader statutory law to be built reliably on top of it.
That's a compelling argument for immediate operability, I'll grant you that. But have you considered that by limiting this foundational work to local regulatory documents, we are in effect constraining the scope of the legal change to something internal and maybe even self-serving? The source material makes a really critical intellectual distinction here, the difference between human decisions as social constructions and algorithmic decisions as technical constructions. Thinkers like Stephen Wolfram have suggested the future of law is computational law, where contracts and statutes have to become, well, explicitly algorithms. Local, dual-version policies, no matter how precise, they just don't solve that core constitutional challenge of defining a new legal ontology for machines.
Wait, let me just stop you there. I think we might be mistaking the necessary starting point for the necessary endpoint. The endpoint may very well be universal computational law, I agree, but the starting point has to be technical operability and guaranteed safety. Let's consider algorithmic and high-frequency trading, HFT. These are extremely powerful autonomous financial systems.
HFT, right? Systems trading millions of shares in milliseconds.
Exactly. They only function safely and efficiently because they operate within a highly specialized, very defined operational context. And this context is enforced not by general law, but by specific regulatory techniques, things like mandatory internal testing, continuous monitoring, and defined structural features of the trading process. The point is, This dedicated context works, even within a hugely complex financial market. I'd also point to the analogy of transport. Air and rail are demonstrably safer than general road transport, despite their immense power and speed, because they rely on dedicated, specialized infrastructure. For a corporate AI, the dual version policy is that specialized infrastructure. It's what guarantees precision.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the analogy holds up entirely when you get to the challenge of corporate governance. HFT operates within extremely rigid transactional rule sets: buy, sell, execute. Transportation relies on physical and logical constraints: tracks, corridors, signal systems. Corporate governance is fundamentally different. It involves inherently subjective, globally accepted principles from the G20 and OECD. Concepts like acting in the best interests of the company or exercising diligence and care. These are not just transactional parameters you can input into a local policy. They require a much deeper philosophical formalization that a localized internal policy can really provide. I mean, such policies will necessarily reflect the company's own interpretation of its self-interest, not the universal standard of care we require from all fiduciaries. So how does your dual document system formally translate the best interests of a global corporation, which includes balancing stakeholders, sustainability, shareholder value, into clear, testable, machine-readable parameters without just collapsing into a simplified, self-serving metric?
Dual version framework reveals itself. The local policy doesn't invent the standard. It specifies precisely how those highly abstract concepts get formalized for the AI, making them concrete, auditable, and testable within that specific corporate ecosystem. Take the concept of informed consent for an example.
Okay. For an AI operating at the corporate level, the policy requires developing more subtle and alternative approaches to user agreements, something beyond the simplistic agree or leave model we see online. The AI version of the policy has to explicitly define how the system will behave not just in normal market conditions, but also in critical situations, stress test scenarios, regulatory shocks, supply chain failures. This process forces that abstract, socially constructed concept of consent or stakeholder awareness to be formalized into measurable operational parameters the AI must follow. And that provides a level of precision and transparency that a vague statutory mandate just can't deliver.
But this brings us squarely back to the challenge of defining complex ethical requirements. Let's look at requirements like ensuring fair statistical risk distribution or guaranteeing non-discrimination. Human-centric tests, like the ones in the moral machine experiment, they focused on easily perceived visible factors: age, race, gender. But AI systems rely on mathematical algorithms driven by vast amounts of data points, far beyond those obvious criteria. Things like geographical location, wealth proxies, historical behavioral patterns. How does a local internal dual version framework genuinely encode complex, evolving ethical expectations without simply translating the existing inherent biases of the human policy setters, the internal legal department, into mathematical weights and parameters?
That's a valid concern about inherited bias, it is. But the dual version mandate acts as a crucial control mechanism, precisely because it mandates transparency around that translation. The corporate policy, specifically in its AI version, must define the specific metrics and criteria the system uses to define and achieve, quote, fair statistical distribution of risk. It can't just say be fair. It has to define the parameters of what fairness means in that context. And similarly, the rule against non-discrimination that requires the policy to mandate regular, rigorous tests that the autonomous system must pass to demonstrate the lack of direct or indirect bias across its outcomes. This is critical. It shifts the entire debate from a subjective, philosophical agreement, I think this is fair, to measurable, technical standards of performance that an auditor can actually check against. This is the only way to manage risk responsibly in an autonomous system.
While it's measurable, the scope of these definitions is still fundamentally bound by the local policy setters, and that's the danger. Consider the mandate to fairly treat stakeholders, including what the source material calls less protected road users in the context of transport ethics. That's a universal ethical principle: protect the vulnerable. translating the idea of protecting vulnerable categories into concrete parameters and corresponding weighting within a corporate AI algorithm, that remains a deep ethical challenge. If a universal principle is at stake, shouldn't that definition be codified at the level of foundational law, forcing all companies to adhere to a common standard, instead of allowing for a localized interpretation that might strategically compromise that principle for corporate gain?
I think that misses the point that local definition fosters necessary technical granularity. And what's more, the local structure is actually superior for enforcing one of the most vital mandates: continuous accountability and due diligence. The G20 OECD principles mandate that directors act with full awareness, diligence, and care. Human directors, they rely on periodic reports, board meetings, quarterly statements. An AI system, however, has the capacity for continuous monitoring and real-time data ingestion that is far beyond what any human can manage.
Agreed. The capacity is immense.
So, a local policy for the AI director must define this enhanced level of diligence. It needs to specify the exact activities, the data sources like global data aggregators, screening in the media and/or judicial reviews, and the precise update schedules for algorithms and models. This formalized continuous informativeness and continuous audit is necessary to meet the spirit of the diligence mandate in a machine context. A broad statutory law would really struggle to specify this technical granularity with the detail needed for investor confidence.
That's a fascinating application of the AI speed. But let's look at history for a moment. The concept of a continuous audit was proposed as far back in 1991. And even then, its authors noted that implementing it would require substantial changes in the nature of evidence, types of procedures, timing, and distributions of efforts in the audit. It demanded a change to the overall operational context of accounting and auditing practice. My point is this: if an AI director performs continuous monitoring in real time, while human directors continue to rely on quarterly reports, the legal standard for diligence has to fundamentally change across the board for everyone to maintain parity and accountability under the law. A local policy simply accommodates the AI's speed by internally changing its procedure. It doesn't change the foundational legal expectation for all corporate directors. That legal standard must be transformed by computational law first. Otherwise, you end up with two standards of diligence operating at the same time.
But this highlights the need for specialized governance. The specialized governance structure required for AI extends beyond just its performance metrics. It extends to the very selection and evaluation of the AI itself. A universal law might state that an AI must be competent, but the local policy structure, it requires defining the specific selection parameters. What kind of training data is acceptable? What are the model's limits? The required tests or exams the AI must pass before deployment, and the precise frequency and scope of algorithm and data updates once it's operational. These are essential requirements for transparency and for investor confidence. I mean, if a major market event happens, investors will want to know if the AI director was operating under an approved, rigorously tested ODD. A broad, universal statute often misses this level of granular operational detail, which is absolutely vital for managing an autonomous entity within a specific corporate structure and minimizing systemic risk.
That is a persuasive point about transparency and selection. But even those requirements, testing frequency, data updates, are effectively defining a new professional standard for a corporate fiduciary. And that standard is so radically different from the human one that it begs the question, is it ethical or even permissible to define a new professional standard through internal corporate policy before the foundational legal framework has sanctioned that new definition?
Permissibility arises from the necessity of operating safely. We have to walk before we can run. The current legal uncertainty around these systems is immense. By establishing a machine-readable OD, we immediately provide certainty, auditability, and a known performance envelope. We shift the discussion from vague philosophical anxiety to concrete, auditable system requirements. This practical step paves the way for the complex computational law you're seeking by generating the precise data and test cases that future statutes will need to rely on.
And I remain wary of the fragmentation. If one major bank defines diligence for its AI, using continuous monitoring of 500 data points, and a competing bank defines it using 50, and both are deemed compliant under their local policies, well, that's regulatory anarchy, not a reliable foundation for law. The legal framework must first establish the minimum universal baseline for AI diligence before it allows local policy to define the technical specifics.
The local policies must adhere to the G20 OECD principles. They can't just invent a standard from thin air. They're forced to interpret existing standards with the necessary machine-readable precision. The argument remains grounded in technical necessity. Autonomous AI systems are like specialized vehicles, trains, planes, that achieve immense safety and efficiency through dedicated, high-precision infrastructure. For corporate governance, that specialized infrastructure starts with the detailed, precise definition of the dual-version operational context and local norms. This is the most actionable and auditable way to proceed right now, creating the bedrock of certainty required before universal legislation can be effectively formalized.
While I appreciate the argument for practical precision and technical operability, I have to maintain my caution about the structural consequences of starting locally. Solving immediate operational hurdles with dual policies might provide short-term relief, but it risks creating a fragmented patchwork that ultimately hinders the necessary deeper legal and philosophical transformation. We need to define the structure of computational law, understanding that difference between social and technical constructs, before we build detailed operational rules on top of what might prove to be a totally inadequate legal foundation.
The evidence shows we have to begin with machine readability to ensure safety today.
And I believe the evidence shows we must begin with a new constitutional structure for AI to ensure long-term accountability.
The introduction of AI into corporate boards necessitates profound changes, whether we approach them from the granular redefinition of operational norms or from the high-level creation of foundational law.
Right. The ultimate challenge for all stakeholders is ensuring that whatever legal framework is adopted, it serves to eliminate, rather than obscure, the complex decision-making processes governing these powerful new autonomous entities.